I'm Arthur Porter, a retired carpenter. I was trying to fix a squeaky floorboard in my daughter Amanda's apartment when she looked at me, her eyes cold, and said, "Dad, we can't afford an extra mouth to feed." She didn't know that old letters from my late wife, kept in my toolbox, held a secret that would do more than just give me a roof over my head. It would teach her the true value of respect. Have you ever felt like your best intentions were seen as a nuisance? Hello, my friends. Whether you're listening to this from your garage in Texas or from that familiar armchair in Florida, let me know you're here. Give this a like and drop a comment to tell me where you're tuning in from. I've got a story for you today. A story about things you never think could happen inside a family. It began, like so many things in a carpenter's life, with a squeak that needed fixing. It all started with an annoying squeak. The floorboard right at the entrance to Amanda and Chad's kitchen had come loose. Every time someone walked over it, it let out this tired little groan, a small sound, but it dug into my ear like a splinter. I'd spent the morning in the corner of the living room they'd cleared out for my things, carefully picking out a few familiar tools from my old Craftsman toolbox. That box was the only piece of my old life that felt completely mine. I pulled out the claw hammer, its wooden handle worn smooth from decades of use, a few screws, my Phillips head screwdriver. The faint smell of grease and old pine from that box was the smell of purpose. It made me feel useful again, like back in the workshop, sawdust on my Red Wing boots. I didn't have much left to give my daughter, not in terms of money, but I still had these hands. I figured at the very least I could fix things. A way to contribute, to not feel like a quiet shadow in their busy lives. I was down on my knees, the foam pads worn and frayed, when Amanda walked into the kitchen. She didn't glance down at me, just went straight for the counter. I heard the whirring of the Keurig machine, a sharp, modern sound, followed by a long, weary sigh. Chad came in right after, and they started whispering. In a small apartment, sound just has a way of finding you. Their whispers were sharp, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerator. Words like bills, cramped, and a phrase that landed like a punch. How much longer? They were talking about me. I could feel my face flush. I kept my head down, pretending to be absorbed by the floorboard, my grip tightening on the hammer. I used to be the man they came to when money was tight. Now I was the problem. I hoped they just figured an old man's ears weren't what they used to be. Then, Amanda walked over to me. Her shadow fell over my hands. I could smell her expensive perfume, a flowery scent that felt out of place. I looked up, ready to tell her I was almost done, that the floor would be quiet in a minute. But she didn't ask about the floor. She looked at me, and it wasn't the look of my little girl. It was the look of a stranger, cool, distant, and measured. And then she said it. Her voice was calm, not a hint of anger in it, just a simple statement of fact. And that calm, that was the thing that cut the deepest. She said, "Dad, we can't afford an extra mouth to feed." The words hung in the air. An extra mouth to feed. It hammered in my head, over and over. In that moment, I wasn't her father anymore. I was a stray they'd taken in, a miscalculation in their monthly budget, a liability that needed to be erased. Chad just stood there by the refrigerator, arms crossed, silent. He nodded once, a small, sharp jerk of his head. His silence was a signature on a document. It was a verdict. It was crueler than her words. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. A man of my generation doesn't do that. You take the hit, and you stand up. My dignity was the last tool I had left, and I wasn't about to let them take that too. I slowly pushed myself up, my knees making a dry, cracking sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I placed the hammer on the floor, gently, as if it were made of glass. All the strength had been siphoned right out of me. My world, which had already shrunk after my wife, Martha, passed away, had now just shattered. There was nothing left but a cold, empty space. Packing was quicker than you'd think. A whole life, more than 60 years of it, boiled down to 2 old suitcases and a metal toolbox. As I dragged the last bag out, my eyes landed on the wedding photo of me and Martha on the bookshelf. Martha, with that smile that could make a bad day good. She believed family was an anchor. I looked at her smiling face and wondered what she would think of the words her daughter had just said. As I pulled my suitcase toward the door, Amanda came over and tried to press a wad of crumpled cash into my hand. "For your expenses," she said, looking away. I didn't take it. My calloused hand, the one that had built her first bookshelf, closed into a fist. Accepting that money would be accepting their story about me. I might be poor, but I'm not a beggar, especially not from my own family. The apartment door clicked shut behind me. The sound of the lock was final. I stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, the smell of industrial disinfectant stinging my nose. I used to be the one who protected this family. Now I was the one being put out, like old furniture that no longer had a purpose. The feeling of being invisible, of being completely lost, had never been so clear. I didn't know where I was going, or what I was going to do. But standing there, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, I knew one thing. I couldn't let her see me break. Not yet. Not ever. I took a deep breath that shuddered in my chest, straightened my old jacket, and walked toward the elevator, stepping into a life I was never prepared for. The motel room I found was right off I-95, one of those cheap, anonymous places. The air inside was a mix of stale bleach and old coffee, a chemical smell trying and failing to cover up the cigarette smoke that had soaked into the curtains years ago. I sat on the edge of the bedspread thin and scratchy, feeling cool against my legs even in the Florida heat. Outside, the endless roar of trucks on the highway was a constant river of noise and energy, a stark contrast to the dead stillness inside of me. I unlatched my steel toolbox and opened the lid. I wasn't looking for a wrench or a screwdriver. I was just looking for something that felt like mine. The familiar scent of WD-40 and old pine hit me, the smell of a lifetime of work, the smell of being useful. And there, nestled between the cold metal tools, was a stack of old letters, tied with a faded blue silk ribbon. Martha's letters. I hadn't dared to read them since she passed. The grief was still too sharp, too close to the surface. But tonight, in this profound and crushing loneliness, I needed to hear her voice, even if it was just through her familiar looping handwriting on faded paper. The first one I picked up had a little drawing of a rocking horse in the corner. I'd made one just like it for Amanda, the Christmas she turned 4. I could still see her eyes, wide and shining in the light of the tree, hear that pure, bell-like laugh of hers echoing through our small house. I'd worked overtime at the shop for a month, then spent my nights in the garage, carving and sanding until my fingers were numb, just so I could afford the good, solid oak. My hands were covered in blisters, but my heart had never felt so full. It was a simple thing, a piece of wood and some paint, but it felt like I had given her a piece of my own strength. Another letter slid out, and tucked inside was a faded Polaroid picture. Amanda, in her high school graduation cap and gown, her arms wrapped around Martha and me. The smile on her face was so bright, so full of hope. It felt like it could light up the world. I remembered the nights after long days at work, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator, going over the numbers again and again, worrying about the student loan so she could go to a good college. Martha and I ate spaghetti with canned sauce for the better part of a year to save every extra dollar we could. We never called it a sacrifice, not even to each other. It was just what you did. It was what parents were supposed to do. It was responsibility. It was love, shown in deeds, not just words. We just wanted her to have a better start than we did, a foundation we had to build for ourselves from scratch. I set the photograph down on the nightstand next to the bed, the smiling face of the girl in the picture, and the cold, distant face of the woman who had dismissed me just hours before. They were the same person. How could both exist in one soul? The contrast was like a physical blow, a knife twisting in a wound I didn't even know was so deep. Every memory of care, every dollar earned with sweat and aching muscles, it all felt like it had been erased by 4 short words. An extra mouth to feed. The feeling of betrayal is so much worse than loss. Loss just takes away your future. Betrayal comes back for your past. It poisons everything, turning your fondest memories into evidence of your own foolishness, your own naive belief in something that was never as solid as you thought. I sat there, just looking at my own hands, calloused, scarred with 100 tiny nicks and cuts from a lifetime of work. These hands built a home. They fixed cars. They raised a child. And now, they just felt empty and useless. It gets me wondering, for all of you friends listening out there, have you ever looked at something you built or fixed? Maybe a sturdy fence, a car engine that finally purrs just right, or even just a faucet that doesn't drip anymore, and felt that quiet sense of pride? That feeling that you made something right in the world? Go ahead and share that little project, that one thing that made you feel truly useful, down in the comments. Sometimes those are the things that hold us together. A rage began to smolder deep inside me, but it wasn't a hot, shouting fire. It was a cold thing, a quiet resolve forming in the wreck of my thoughts. I couldn't change what Amanda had done, but I couldn't let her action be the final word on my life. I didn't know what I was going to do next, not by a long shot, but I knew I had to get back on my feet. For Martha, who always believed in the man I was, and for myself, for the man who once took so much pride in what his hands could do. I gently placed the letters and the photo back into the toolbox, arranging them carefully. This time, they didn't feel like the weight of a past I had lost. They felt like a reminder of the man I had been, and a lighthouse to guide me back to the man I had to be again. Among the stack of old letters, one envelope stood out. It was made of thick parchment-like paper, heavier than the others, and sealed not with glue, but with a small, neat circle of wax bearing the faint imprint of a flower. On the front, Martha's elegant script read, "Only open when you truly need it." I looked around the grimy motel room, at the life that now fit into 2 suitcases and a toolbox, and I thought, I don't think I've ever truly needed anything more than I do right now. My hand trembled slightly as I broke the seal. For a moment it felt like I was trespassing on a final secret, but the thought vanished. This was a gift, not a diary. Inside there wasn't a familiar letter full of gossip and love. It was a sheaf of official documents, copies of old bank statements, and a single handwritten letter on top to explain it all. Martha's voice in the letter was as gentle as I remembered, but the words she had written carried the weight of a gravestone. Martha, my quiet, simple wife, who always claimed she was no good with numbers, had apparently been a secret and shrewd investor. All these years, she had been quietly growing a small inheritance from her grandmother, a sum I thought we'd spent entirely on a new roof 20 years ago. Piece by piece, year after year, she had built a significant portfolio. I saw the statements, the careful transactions. She'd bought shares in companies we believed in, names I knew from the commercials on our old television. John Deere. I could almost smell the fresh-cut hay and hear the rumble of a diesel engine just looking at the name. I'd always respected the solid, no-nonsense engineering of their machines. Procter & Gamble, because she always said you could trust a company that made things people needed every single day. It was a portfolio built on common sense and patience. "I want you to have a peaceful old age, Arthur," she wrote. "One where you can work in your wood shop because you want to, not because you have to. An old age where you never have to depend on anyone, where you can be truly free. I sat there, stunned, on the lumpy motel bed. The numbers on the final page of the most recent statement seemed to swim before my eyes. I had to take off my reading glasses and wipe them on my shirt, thinking the cheap motel light was playing tricks on me. It couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to ordinary carpenters like me. My entire life had been built on the belief in honest labor, in a steady paycheck and a small, hard-won savings account. This world of stocks and dividends, of capital gains and compound interest, was as foreign to me as the surface of Mars. But this was Martha's handwriting, unmistakable and clear. These were official bank seals, crisp and embossed on the paper. And this was the name of a reputable law firm in the city center. It was all real. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and it wasn't because of the money. It was the sudden, earth-shattering realization that I hadn't fully known the woman I'd shared my life with for 40 years. The first feeling that hit me wasn't joy. It was a deep, profound wave of sorrow, an ache of regret so sharp it took my breath away. Martha had carried this secret, this plan, this worry for me, all by herself for years. How many nights had she sat up after I was asleep, looking over these very papers? I thought about all the times I'd complained about a tight budget or a big expense, never knowing she was quietly building a fortress to protect my future. This was her final act of love, a safety net woven from quiet wisdom and incredible patience. The sharp, cold pain of Amanda's betrayal was still there, a throbbing wound. But now it felt like it was being wrapped in the boundless warmth of Martha's love, a thick wool blanket on a winter night. Even from beyond the grave, she was still taking care of me. As the first hints of dawn began to streak the sky, filtering gray light through the cheap motel curtains, my eyes fell on the paper with the name and phone number of the lawyer Martha had trusted. An idea began to form in my mind, not as a hot flash of anger, but as a cool, clear thought. It wasn't about revenge. Men of my generation don't waste time on things like that. It was about a lesson. A quiet lesson in respect, in dignity, and in the danger of underestimating a quiet old man. My daughter had dismissed me as a financial liability, a burden to be cast off. She saw value only in what could be counted in a bank account. Perhaps it was time to show her how finances really worked, not with angry words, but with calm, deliberate action. I reached for the old beige telephone on the nightstand. The plastic felt cheap and hollow in my hand. For the first time since that door clicked shut behind me, I felt a clear sense of purpose flowing through my veins, a quiet strength I thought I had lost forever. I was no longer Arthur, the discarded father, the extra mouth to feed. I was about to become someone else, someone even I had never met. I picked up the receiver and listened to the steady hum of the dial tone. I deliberately pressed each button, the sounds echoing in the quiet room. When a voice answered on the other end, mine was perfectly steady and calm. "Hello," I said. "My name is Arthur. I believe you've been managing some affairs for my late wife, Martha." The world had shifted under my feet, and for the first time in a long time, I was the one deciding which way to step next. Mr. Davison's law office was on the top floor of a gleaming glass building downtown. Everything was polished, silent, and expensive in a way that seemed to absorb sound. It was a world away from the honest noise and sawdust of the workshops I'd spent my life in. The air smelled of leather and floor polish, a clean chemical scent so different from the familiar smell of wood and oil. I'd worn my best LL Bean flannel shirt, the one Martha always said brought out the blue in my eyes. But I still felt small and out of place against the dark mahogany walls, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. The lawyer, Mr. Davison, was a man about my age with a firm handshake and a way of looking you straight in the eye that immediately commanded respect. He remembered Martha, and when he spoke of her, It was with a genuine admiration that settled my nerves. "She was a remarkably intelligent and far-sighted woman, your wife," he said, gesturing for me to sit. That one sentence made me trust him completely. He spread the documents across a desk that was as big as my first workbench. With a patience I appreciated, he walked me through everything, explaining the legal terms in plain, simple English that a man who worked with his hands could understand. He spoke of dividends, of commercial real estate holdings, of a trust that had been established in my name years ago. He explained how Martha's strategy wasn't about risky bets, but about slow, steady belief in solid American companies, the power of patience. Martha had planned for every contingency with the same meticulous care she used to plan her garden each spring. When Mr. Davison finally got to the bottom line, the total value of the trust, he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk to me. I looked at the number, and I had to physically grip the arms of the leather chair to steady myself. A faint ringing started in my ears. It was a sum so far beyond my imagination that it didn't seem real. It wasn't just enough money to live on for the rest of my days. It was enough to buy the entire city block Amanda lived on, let alone her apartment. And so I told him everything. About Amanda, about Chad, about the 4 words, an extra mouth to feed, that had pushed me out the door. I didn't raise my voice or let it crack. I just laid out the facts, clear and concise, the same way I'd report a flaw in a building's foundation. Mr. Davison listened with a quiet intensity, never interrupting, just giving a slow, thoughtful nod from time to time as he steepled his fingers. When I was finished, a long silence filled the room. He looked at me over his tortoiseshell glasses, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Mr. Jensen," he said, "your wife gave you more than just money. She gave you choices. The question now is, what do you want to do with them?" It was the same question I'd been asking myself all night in that cheap motel room, and now I had the answer. It had settled in my mind, as solid and clear as a length of steel. "I don't want my daughter on the street," I said, and my voice was firm, surprising even myself. "That's not what this is about. I just want her to understand. I want her to understand the real value of a home, the real value of respect." I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. Then an idea that had been a faint flicker before, now burned bright and clear. "That apartment building they live in," I asked, trying to sound casual. "Do you think it's for sale?" A plan was clicking into place in my head, as neat and precise as a blueprint. Walking out of that building and into the bright afternoon sun, I felt the warmth on my face and stood a little taller. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't a burden. That feeling of financial independence, of not having to rely on anyone for your next meal or your roof, it's a different kind of strength. It's a foundation. I know a lot of you in my generation worked your fingers to the bone to build something to leave for your kids. But have you ever thought about setting up a plan, a trust, to make sure you yourself are independent in your later years? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the best way to take care of your children is to make sure you've taken care of yourself first, so you're never a burden on their conscience or their wallet. Back in the office, Mr. Davison had raised an eyebrow at my question. Then a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. He understood immediately. He turned his computer monitor toward me. As it happened, the corporation that owned the Oak Creek Apartments was having financial troubles and was quietly looking to liquidate some of its assets to restructure. It was easily within my means. "We can set up a limited liability company, an LLC," Mr. Davison suggested, "all business now. Think of it as a strong new toolbox, Mr. Jensen. It keeps your personal tools separate and protected from the job site. All transactions will be completely anonymous. They will send their rent checks to a management company, and that company will answer to the LLC. They will never know who the new owner is." I looked at the screen, at the numbers and the legal structures, and for the first time, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt a sense of clarity. I nodded. Just like that, I had the plan. Now it was time to start building. The process of buying the building was surprisingly fast and quiet. Everything was handled through the LLC Mr. Davison had created for me, a company with a deliberately bland and forgettable name that couldn't be traced back to me in a million years. When I sat in Mr. Davison's office to sign the final papers, the pen felt light and unfamiliar in my hand. For 40 years, my tools had been hammers and saws, heavy, honest things that created tangible results. This pen felt like a feather, yet it was moving more weight than a crane. It was a new kind of power I was learning to wield. To the outside world, the new owner of the Oak Creek Apartments was a faceless investment group from another state. To me, it was the first solid step I'd taken to reclaim my own life. I didn't feel a rush of excitement or the satisfaction of revenge. Instead, what settled over me was a profound calm, a deep focus. It felt like the moment before you begin framing a house. Every measurement has to be precise. Every nail has to be driven true. This was just a different kind of construction. I didn't move into a fancy penthouse or a beachfront condo. That's not who I am. Instead, I found a small, clean one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, in a quiet complex mostly for retirees. The loudest noise you ever heard was the whir of the sprinklers in the morning. I bought a few simple pieces of furniture, a good coffee maker, and most importantly, a leather lazy boy recliner. I placed it by the window, and it became my new command center. Every morning, I'd get up, pour a mug of coffee, and sit in that chair with my laptop. It was my new form of going to work. I'd read the weekly reports emailed from the property management company. I knew about the leaky faucet in 3A, the overgrown lawn behind the west parking lot, the burned-out hallway light on the 4th floor. And I knew every maintenance request and every late payment associated with Unit 2B, where my daughter lived. I read a note about a slow drain in their kitchen sink, and I felt a strange, detached pang of knowledge. They were living their lives, completely unaware that the small, everyday details and frustrations of their world were now under my absolute control. The management company, eager to impress a new owner, sent a proposal for a list of improvements the building desperately needed, things the old owners had let slide for years. A complete repainting of the hallways in a warmer, more welcoming color. An overhaul of the notoriously fickle elevator system. I read a report that it had trapped Mrs. Gable from 4C for 10 minutes last month. New landscaping with roses and gardenias by the entrance to welcome people home. I read through the list, my mind picturing the dingy corridors and the dying shrubs I remembered. I approved everything without a moment's hesitation. I wanted the place to be better, a place people were proud to live in. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing for a whole building what I had tried to do in Amanda's apartment, fixing things, making them better, but on a much larger scale. This time, no one was dismissing my efforts as a nuisance. This time, my work was respected. This time, I was building a community, not just fixing a floorboard. In one of the reports, I asked for a full market analysis of the building's rental rates. The results were about what I expected. The management company sent back a detailed report, full of charts and local comparisons. On average, the rents were a good 25% below the going rate for similar properties within a 1-mile radius. They recommended a phased increase for new leases and renewals to cover the costs of the renovations, and to bring the property in line with its market value. My eyes scanned the document until I found the section for 2-bedroom units, the kind Amanda and Chad lived in. I looked at the current rent they were paying, a sweetheart deal they'd gotten from the previous owner, and then at the proposed market rate. The new number was nearly 3 times higher. I did the math in my head, calculating the difference. The amount they were saving each month, a privilege they took for granted, was more than enough to have supported me without a single complaint. I'll admit, I hesitated for a long moment. My finger hovered over the trackpad of my laptop. This was the move. This was the nail that would join the frame together. It would cause a genuine earthquake in their lives, and a part of me, the father in me, recoiled from that. I looked out the window at the quiet, peaceful lives of my new neighbors. But then I saw her face in my mind, as clear as if she were standing in front of me. I saw that cool, measured look as she priced my existence and found it wanting. She had reduced my life, my love, my entire being down to a number on a balance sheet. She had chosen to live in a world where everything has a price. Fine. It was time for that world to send her the bill. This wasn't punishment. It was education. I typed a short, simple email back to the management company. Proceed with the recommendations. Apply the new market rates for all upcoming lease renewals. I hit send. I knew it wouldn't be long now. A formal letter printed on the management company's heavy official letterhead would be slid under the door of apartment 2B. A single piece of paper that would change everything for Amanda and Chad. They wouldn't know who it came from. They would only feel the sudden, immense pressure of an invisible force, a ghost landlord they couldn't bargain with or appeal to. They would have to face the hard reality of the world they so admired, a world run by numbers and contracts. I leaned back in my chair. I had set the machine in motion. Now, from the quiet comfort of my lazy boy, I would wait. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I know this because I received a short, professional email from the management company with the subject line, Notification Dispatch Confirmation. The email confirmed that all tenant notices regarding the approved market rate adjustments had been delivered. I sat in my chair and pictured it, a single thick envelope lying on the worn brown doormat in front of apartment 2B. I imagined it standing out from the usual collection of junk mail and bills. It wasn't a flimsy piece of paper. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper that carries the weight of an unchangeable decision. Inside, I knew, were the carefully chosen, legally vetted words, polite but cold, informing them of the rent adjustment, effective at the start of their new lease term in 30 days. No lengthy apologies, no room for negotiation. Just a fact. In my mind, I could see the whole scene play out. I pictured Amanda coming home from work, tired, probably kicking off her shoes the moment she walked in the door. She'd see the envelope, maybe assume it was a promotional offer for a new credit card or some other piece of official-looking junk. I imagined her tearing it open carelessly as she walked toward the kitchen to pour a glass of wine, her eyes scanning the first few lines with casual indifference. Then, the pause, the little frown. I could almost see the moment her casual glance would sharpen into a stare of disbelief, her eyes darting back to the top of the page and then down to the number. The number. I could almost hear the sharp, sudden intake of her breath, a number that would instantly transform their affordable apartment into a luxury they could no longer afford. A cold, impersonal number that didn't care about their plans, their budget, or their lifestyle. Indignation would be the next emotion, I figured, flaring up hot and fast. Not indignation at themselves, of course, but at the world. I pictured her pacing the living room, crushing the notice in her fist, ranting to Chad about the greed of it all, the corporate exploitation. I could hear them, sitting at their kitchen counter, complaining about an unjust world, about faceless, heartless rich people in New York or California who were ruining things for everyone. They would complain, and not for one single second would they recognize the crushing irony in their own words. They had become the victims of the exact same logic they had used to discard me, a cold financial decision with no room for sentiment. The property manager's weekly report, which arrived in my inbox the next morning, confirmed I wasn't far off. There was a special note under the section for tenant communications. The manager, a man named Mr. Harris, wrote that he had received a highly agitated phone call from the primary tenant in Unit 2B. Amanda had demanded to speak directly with the new owner. She had called the rent increase predatory and had threatened to contact the local news to report on their unethical practices. The request to speak with me was, of course, politely but firmly denied. All communication must go through the management company, was the calm corporate answer she received. Amanda, the one who always had to be in control, was now talking to a wall. A polite, professional, and utterly immovable wall. She couldn't negotiate. She couldn't manipulate. She couldn't use tears or anger to get her way. She was left with nothing but the numbers on the page. Getting an unexpected bill or a sudden price hike can really shake you. It makes you feel like you've lost your footing, like the ground underneath you isn't as solid as you thought it was. It's a feeling of losing control. I'm sure many of you listening have been there. Have you ever faced a sudden financial shock like that? Something that came out of the blue and threatened to throw everything off course? What was the first thing you did to get your bearings, to try and take back some of that control? Share your experiences in the comments. I think we could all learn from each other about how to weather these sudden storms. That night, I sat in my lazy boy, sipping a cup of warm chamomile tea. Through my window, I could see the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. I felt no joy, no triumphant glee. What I felt instead was a heavy, necessary sense of consequence. The first stone had been thrown into the placid surface of the pond. Now it was time to watch the ripples spread. It was time for them to learn that the world they so admired, a world of numbers and bottom lines, could be just as cold to them as they had been to me. The lesson was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed, my silence was the most powerful tool I had. The pressure of the new rent deadline was building on the horizon like a dark thunderhead, a storm of their own making that was about to break. I know my daughter. I raised her. I remember when she was a little girl, if she didn't get the toy she wanted, she wouldn't just get sad. She'd find a way to make it her brother's fault. When Amanda is cornered, she doesn't look inward for a solution. She looks outward for someone to blame. For years, I had been the one to absorb that blame, to act as a buffer for her frustrations, a steady wall to absorb the impact. But now, I was gone. And the closest, easiest person left to bear that weight was Chad. I could practically feel the tension in apartment 2B from across town, an atmosphere so thick you could cut it with a knife. I imagined their conversations had started with sighs of frustration, before quickly spiraling into a bitter tally of small resentments and accusations. I pictured it starting over dinner, maybe over a half-eaten meatloaf that was growing cold on their plates. I could see Amanda pushing her food around with her fork, her voice laced with a familiar, sharp edge. She'd criticized Chad's job, his lack of ambition, the promotion he should have gotten months ago. "My friends' husbands are closing deals, Chad. They're moving up. What are you doing?" she might say. I could see Chad's shoulders tense up, his face hardening as he fired back, pointing out her spending habits, the endless stream of decorative pillows and scented candles that filled their apartment, the expensive dinners out with friends that appeared on their credit card statements. "Maybe if you didn't need a new throw pillow from Pottery Barn every week," I imagined him saying, "we'd actually have a savings account." The very same accusations they had once whispered about me, being a financial drain, were now the weapons they turned on each other. Money has a strange way of acting like a solvent, dissolving the thin veneer of politeness and revealing the raw, ugly truths underneath. It made me think back to their wedding. Everything had been so grand, so expensive, meticulously planned to impress their guests. I remember the ice sculpture of two swans, how it had melted into a puddle by the end of the night. A fitting symbol for it all. Their whole relationship, it seemed to me, was built on appearances. The stylish apartment, the new model car, the picture-perfect vacations posted on Facebook. But that kind of foundation is thin. It's not built with the sturdy beams of mutual respect or the load-bearing walls of shared sacrifice. It's not designed to weather a storm. It was a house built with credit cards and bank loans, designed to look good in the sunshine. And now that a real financial squall had hit, that foundation was shaking, and the cracks were beginning to show. They say money can't buy happiness, and I believe that's true. But a lack of it, or the stress of it, can certainly put a relationship to the test. It can act as a powerful glue, forcing two people to band together to survive. Or it can be the wedge that drives them apart for good. It makes me think that hardship doesn't create a person's character. It reveals it. I remember a time, years ago, when a big contract fell through and Martha and I were stretched thin. We sat at the same kitchen table Amanda and Chad were likely arguing at now, but instead of blaming each other, we made a plan together. That shared struggle made us stronger. Have you found that to be true in your life? That the tough times either bring people closer or push them further away? I'd be interested to read about your own experiences in the comments. My weekly report from the property manager confirmed that the cracks were becoming fractures. A new line item had appeared, one I had been expecting. Noise complaints from units neighboring 2B. The report detailed late-night shouting matches, loud arguments that echoed in the newly painted hallways. One neighbor, a quiet woman in 2A, was quoted as saying, "It sounds like a war zone over there sometimes." The report also noted that Amanda had tried to organize the other tenants to sign a petition protesting the rent increase. Her effort had failed spectacularly. Most of the residents, while not happy about paying more, were pleased with the improvements. The hallways were clean, the elevator worked perfectly, and the new gardens were beautiful. They were practical people. They accepted the new reality. Amanda and Chad were now completely and utterly alone in a battle of their own making, isolated by their own outrage. I reached into my old toolbox, the one that now sat in the corner of my new living room, and took out a small block of basswood and my favorite whittling knife. I started to carve. A songbird. My hands still knew the work, still found a sense of peace in the familiar, repetitive motions, focusing on the careful cuts, on the way the curls of wood fell away, kept my mind calm. It kept me from getting drawn into the anger and the chaos I was observing from a distance. As I worked the wood, I thought about how you have to understand its grain. You can't force it. You have to work with it. You apply pressure carefully, precisely, to get the shape you want. With every slice of the blade, I reminded myself of my purpose. This wasn't a punishment. This was a stress test, a reality check. I had simply applied pressure to the structure they had built, and it was failing. The phone rang on a Saturday morning. I was sitting on my small back patio, enjoying the simple, quiet pleasure of a weekend. The Florida sun was warm on my face, a gentle warmth that felt nothing like the oppressive heat of summer. A light breeze carried the scent of gardenias from my neighbor's yard. I had a cup of coffee, black and strong, steaming on the small metal table beside me, and the local newspaper was spread across my lap. I was reading a thoroughly uninteresting article about a new zoning ordinance. The world felt quiet, and for the first time in a while, so did my mind. Then the phone buzzed, a harsh electronic sound that shattered the peace. I looked at the screen and saw a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Amanda. A painful, familiar knot tightened in my chest. A small, foolish part of me, the part that will always be a father, leaped with a flicker of hope. My mind started racing. Maybe this is it, the hopeful part whispered. Maybe the hardship has taught her something. Maybe she's calling to apologize. I let it ring, the sound drilling into the morning calm. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the voice of reason argue back. Don't be a fool, Arthur. Think about the timing. She's had weeks to call. She's only calling now because the rent is due. It was a battle between my heart and my head, between the father I used to be and the man I was trying to become. I let it ring one more time, steeled myself, and then I answered. Dad? Her voice on the other end was strained, but it was coated with a thin, artificial sweetness that I knew all too well. It was the same voice she used as a little girl, right before asking for something expensive. I had a sudden, sharp memory of her at 10 years old, using that exact tone to ask for a pink Schwinn bicycle with handlebar tassels, a bike that cost more than a week's wages for me back then. Martha and I had made it happen, of course. We always did. She asked how I was doing, a hollow pleasantry she didn't really wait for an answer to. I kept my own voice even and short. "I'm doing okay, Amanda." My quietness seemed to throw her off, but only for a second. She didn't waste much time getting to the real reason for her call. She began to unload a long, well-rehearsed tale of woe. As she spoke, I could almost see the script she had practiced in her head. She spoke of the nightmare new landlord, the unreasonable rent increase, and how they were struggling so much they might be forced out onto the street. She painted a picture of two young victims being crushed by a faceless, greedy corporation, using dramatic words like predatory and unethical. She spoke to me as if I were an old acquaintance she'd run into at the grocery store, someone to vent to for a moment of sympathy. In her entire long-winded monologue, a story that was all about her problems, her stress, her misfortune. Not once did she ask where I was living. Not once did she ask how I'd managed after I left her home. Not a single question about my life. Her world, I realized, still had only one resident, herself. And then, as predictable as the sun rising in the east, the real reason for the call arrived. There was a slight pause, a calculated breath to set the stage. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a lower, more conspiratorial tone. "I know things are probably tight for you too, but I was wondering if you could maybe help us out. Just a little, just to get us through this rough patch. You know, just a small loan for a deposit on a new place." A long silence stretched between us. In that quiet moment, I could feel the last stubborn ember of hope inside me turn to cold, gray ash. It wasn't just that she was asking for money. It was how she was asking. It was the confirmation that she didn't see me as her father, not really. She saw me as a resource, an old piece of emergency equipment stored in the back of a closet, forgotten until there's a crisis. She hadn't called her father. She had called an ATM. A cold wave of disappointment washed over me, but it brought with it an incredible, clarifying calm. Every last bit of hesitation I might have had about my plan vanished. The father's heart, that had been foolishly hoping just minutes before, was now silent. I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. My voice, when I finally spoke, was perfectly steady, without a trace of the anger or bitterness she was likely expecting. It held only a simple, unshakable truth. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, Amanda," I said, "but I can't help you." I offered no reason, no excuse or explanation. The simple, clean refusal was all that was needed. It was a solid wall, and it gave her nothing to argue against, nothing to manipulate. I could hear a sharp, stunned intake of breath on the other end of the line, the sound of someone who had just walked into a wall they thought was an open door. Before she could recover, before the sweetness could curdle into anger, I gently hung up the phone. I placed the phone back on the table. My hand was perfectly steady. There were no tears in my eyes. There was only a quiet acceptance and a sadness so deep it felt like it had settled into my bones. It was a sadness for her, not for me. My daughter had learned nothing. She still believed that every problem could be solved with someone else's money, that she could always find a safety net to catch her, and that meant the lesson had to continue. I thought about the songbirds I carved. A mother bird has to push her chicks from the nest. If she didn't, they would never learn the strength of their own wings. Continuing to feed them in the nest wouldn't be an act of love. It would be an act of crippling them. I was learning that sometimes a father's love isn't about what you give. It's about what you refuse to give, so that your child can finally learn to fly on their own. The property management company scheduled a residents' meeting for Thursday night to announce the next phase of renovations and to answer questions. This was it. This was the stage I had been preparing for. Mr. Davison had advised against it. "There's no need for you to reveal yourself, Arthur," he had said over the phone, his voice laced with professional caution. "It's cleaner this way. Less personal. You've already won." But I knew he was wrong. A win on paper wasn't enough. I explained that this was never just about money or a building. "You can hire lawyers to handle a contract, Mr. Davison," I'd told him, "but some jobs you have to do yourself." This was about my name, my story. I had to do this, not for Amanda, not to publicly shame her, but for me. For the man who had been made to feel invisible. I needed to end this chapter myself, in my own voice, out in the open. I arrived early and chose a chair in the back row of the community room. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and sugar cookies. As the other residents filed in, I watched them. I saw the worry on the face of a young couple, the resignation on an older woman's face, the simple curiosity on others. These were the people whose lives I had indirectly affected, and I felt a responsibility to them. I wore a simple, clean sport coat. Nothing fancy, but it was pressed and neat. I sat up straight. I wasn't the hunched, apologetic carpenter anymore. I was a man who had found his footing. Amanda and Chad came in just before the meeting started, looking tired and irritable. They scanned the room for allies, their eyes passing right over me without a flicker of recognition. I was just another old man in the back of a room. They sat in the front row, clutching a sheaf of papers, ready for a fight, ready to perform their role as the victims one last time. The meeting unfolded just as I'd expected. The manager, Mr. Harris, talked about the plans to upgrade the building's central air conditioning and repave the parking lot. He was professional, efficient. Then he opened the floor for questions. Amanda was the first one on her feet, brandishing her papers like a weapon. She launched into a passionate, rehearsed speech, throwing around words like inhumane, predatory, and a complete lack of transparency. She was trying to cast herself as a champion of the people, a warrior fighting for the oppressed tenants against the villainous, invisible landlord. Chad sat beside her, nodding in pathetic agreement at every pause. Watching her, I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound sadness. She was so good at this performance, so convincing in a role built entirely on a lie. She pointed out the new flowers in the garden, twisting the improvement into a cynical ploy to justify the exorbitant rent. When she finished, a tense silence fell over the room. Mr. Harris, right on cue, maintained a calm expression. "Thank you for your comments, ma'am. We certainly take these concerns seriously," he said smoothly. "And in the interest of full transparency, I'd like to introduce a representative from the ownership group, the man who has personally approved these improvements." He paused, letting the anticipation build. A little piece of theater we had planned. Then he gestured to the back of the room. "Please welcome Mr. Arthur Jensen." Every head in the room turned. My name hung in the air, confusing at first. In that instant, it felt as if all the sound had been vacuumed out of the room, leaving only the low hum of the old air conditioner. I rose slowly from my chair. My joints protested for a half second, a reminder of my age, and then I found my strength. I began to walk toward the front, my steps steady and deliberate on the worn linoleum floor. Each step was an earthquake in Amanda's world. I could feel her eyes locked on me, her stare like a physical force. As I drew closer, I could see her brain struggling to connect the dots, to process the impossible. I walked past the other tenants, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Then I passed her row. I glanced at her face. It was a canvas of cascading horror. I saw the initial flicker of confusion give way to wide-eyed disbelief. I saw the moment her mind rejected what her eyes were seeing, followed by the second, sickening moment when the entire truth crashed down upon her like a tidal wave. Her mouth fell open slightly, the color draining from her face, her carefully prepared notes fluttering from her hand to the floor. Chad just stared, his face pale and slack-jawed, looking back and forth between me and Amanda, as if the world had turned upside down. I reached the front and stood next to the manager, under the flat, white light of the fluorescent panels. I took a moment, letting the silence settle. I didn't look at Amanda. I looked out at her neighbors, at the dozen or so ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. "Good evening," I said. My voice was clear and strong, and it didn't shake. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly who he was. "My name is Arthur Jensen. I'm not a corporation from New York. I'm a father and a retired carpenter. I bought this building because I believe a home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's the foundation of a person's dignity. And dignity is something we should all treat with respect." I let that hang in the air for a moment. Every improvement being made here, from the new elevator parts to the flowers out front, is for that purpose: to create a safe, clean, and dignified place for you all to live. I paused, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you." I said nothing more. I didn't need to. I had said everything that needed to be said, not with accusations, but with the simple, undeniable truth of my presence. The room remained silent for a long moment, the residents looking from me to my daughter, the whole story now laid bare for them to see. I turned and walked back to my chair, leaving my daughter and her husband sitting alone in the wreckage. After the meeting, Amanda and Chad didn't say a word. Not to me, not to anyone. They just stood up, gathered their things with their heads bowed, and walked out of the community room, disappearing into the night, under the curious and whispering gazes of their neighbors. About a week later, the management company forwarded me an email. It was a 30-day notice to vacate from Unit 2B. They couldn't stand the shame, I suppose, of facing those same neighbors every day. I hadn't evicted them. In the end, their own pride and their own actions had made it impossible for them to stay. It was the quiet, inevitable consequence of their own choices. My life began to settle into a new rhythm, one of my own making. I was no longer the ghost landlord. A couple of times a week I'd drive over to the building, not as the owner making an inspection, but just as a neighbor. I'd chat with the residents, ask about their families, listen to their concerns. I helped old Mrs. Gable from 4C fix a wobbly leg on her antique dining table. I found a real sense of purpose in these small acts of service. With a portion of the building's profits, I worked with Mr. Davison to set up a small fund at the local community center. We called it the Martha Fund, and its purpose was simple: to provide small grants to low-income seniors in the area who needed emergency home repairs. A leaky roof in the rainy season, a broken furnace in the winter. My own private pain had found a public purpose. I started spending most of my afternoons in the community center's woodshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and honest work. I volunteered to teach a basic carpentry class to some of the teenagers in the neighborhood, kids who were looking for something to do with their hands other than get into trouble. I taught them how to hold a saw straight, how to read the grain of a piece of wood, how to measure twice and cut once. I taught them the patience it takes to build something useful and lasting with their own two hands. I found a deep, simple joy in passing on the skills my own father had passed on to me. I was building a legacy, not of money in a trust fund, but of knowledge and care, passed from one generation to the next. For the first time in years, I felt truly and completely useful again. Several months later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It had no return address, just my name and address written in a familiar looping script. It was from Amanda. It wasn't a letter asking for money or a letter full of complaints. It was an apology, written across several pages of notebook paper. She wrote that they'd had to move into a much smaller apartment in a rougher part of town. Chad was driving for Uber at night after his day job. Amanda had picked up a second job, waitressing on weekends. For the first time in their lives, she wrote, they truly understood the stress of living paycheck to paycheck, the constant grinding worry, and the incredible blessing of a safe, stable roof over their heads. She said she was sorry, not for what she had lost, but for what she had done to me. "We had a home," she wrote in one place, the ink a little smudged, "and we were so busy trying to build a lifestyle, we forgot to build a life." I still haven't answered her letter. Maybe one day I will. Forgiveness, I'm learning, isn't a light switch you can just flip on. It's a long road. It's a choice you have to make every single day, and I'm not sure I'm there yet. But today, as I sit here in my lazy boy, looking out the window of my quiet apartment, I feel a deep and abiding sense of peace. I can see the community garden I helped the tenants plant, the roses and gardenias blooming in the afternoon sun. The storm has passed. The sun is out. And for an old man, that's more than enough. My life isn't over. It's just quieter. It's simpler. And it's my own. Life goes on. As I sat there, I realized my story had found its closing chapter, but it also felt like the beginning of a new conversation. It made me think not just about my own journey, but about all the other stories out there, waiting to be heard. You know, when men like us who've been around the block a few times get to talking, the stories just seem to pour out. Today, I've opened up my own heart a little, and I'd be honored to hear from all of you in return. You know, sometimes a simple like, a subscribe, or a share can seem like a small passing gesture. But to me, and to the other quiet voices that need to be shared, every single click is a light in the darkness. It says, "I see you. I hear you. Your story matters." Now that I've told my story, what I want most is to listen to yours. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. Was there a time you felt dismissed or unheard? What passion did someone else once call foolish? Or what was a moment you found your own strength, even in a quiet way? Please, share. I will read them, and I will carry them with me, because your stories are important. I want to build a community here, with WAWA Ages, a place where we men, fathers and grandfathers, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. If you don't have a hardship to share today, then tell me about a small joy. What made you smile today? And if you're watching this on a television, don't hesitate to pick up your phone and look up my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's make this a community where no man has to feel like his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you for sitting with me today. It means more than you know.